Somebody stop him before he hurts himself. The scream echoed across the 42nd floor of Sterling Dynamics, sharp enough to silence a room full of executives in less than a second. Glass walls reflected panic from every direction. Expensive leather chairs scraped against polished marble floors. A silver coffee cup tipped sideways near the conference table, dark liquid spreading slowly like a stain no one had time to notice. Under the massive walnut boardroom table, 8-year-old Eli Sterling rocked back and forth violently, his small hands pressed tight against his ears as though the voices around him physically hurt. His breathing came in broken gasps. Every few seconds, another terrified sound escaped his throat, raw and desperate, the kind of sound that made even adults uncomfortable because it carried something deeper than fear. It carried helplessness. "Back away," one therapist whispered nervously, palms raised. "Too much stimulation is making it worse." But nobody listened. They kept talking anyway. Men in tailored suits crowded closer. Women with company badges whispered over each other. One executive tried offering the boy a tablet. Another suggested medication. Someone else called for security. The noise stacked higher and higher until it felt like the room itself was vibrating. At the center of it all stood Richard Sterling, billionaire founder. 6'3", silver tie slightly loosened for the first time all day. His jaw clenched so tightly a vein pulsed near his temple. He looked nothing like the calm financial titan magazines loved to photograph beside private jets and skyscrapers. Right now he looked like a father watching his world crack open in public. "Eli," he said carefully, lowering himself toward the table. "Look at me, son." The boy screamed louder. Richard froze. Around him, the board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Nobody knew where to look anymore. The quarterly merger meeting had dissolved into chaos 20 minutes ago when Eli wandered into the executive floor after slipping past his nanny downstairs. At first he'd been quiet, clutching the sleeve of his oversized blue hoodie while staring at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Then one executive accidentally dropped a metal binder. The sharp clang shattered the silence. Since then, the child hadn't stopped spiraling. One woman from Human Resources quietly muttered, "Maybe we should clear the room." Another whispered back, "This is exactly why he shouldn't be up here." Richard heard both comments. His face darkened, but exhaustion swallowed his anger before it could fully rise. Across the hallway, unnoticed by nearly everyone, Naomi Carter slowly stopped pushing her janitor cart. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly against the polished corridor. She stood still, one gloved hand resting on the cart handle, while Eli's cries carried through the half-open boardroom doors. Her eyes shifted toward the room instantly. Not curious, recognizing. That sound hit somewhere old inside her chest. Something buried years ago beneath overdue bills, night shifts, and memories she rarely allowed herself to touch anymore. A young executive brushed past her without making eye contact. "Maintenance staff needs to clear this hallway immediately," he snapped. Naomi nodded once. Quiet. Invisible. The way people preferred her. But instead of walking away, she glanced through the glass wall into the boardroom one more time. Her gaze settled on Eli beneath the table. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, her expression changed. Because in the middle of all that panic, the boy kept repeating two broken words under his breath. "Blue shapes, blue shapes." And the moment Naomi heard that phrase, the color drained from her face. Naomi did not move right away. Around her, the executive hallway buzzed with nervous energy as assistants hurried between offices carrying tablets and bottled water nobody was drinking. Somewhere near the elevators, a woman quietly cried into her phone. But Naomi stayed frozen beside her janitor cart, staring through the glass wall at the terrified little boy beneath the conference table. "Blue shapes," Eli whispered again between shaky breaths. "Blue shapes." Naomi closed her eyes for half a second. The words dragged her backward through time, so fast, it almost stole the air from her lungs. 12 years. Earlier, before cleaning uniforms and overnight shifts became her reality, she used to sit inside a very different room on the 29th floor of Sterling Dynamics. Back then she wore pencil skirts instead of rubber gloves. She carried research folders instead of trash liners. And every Thursday afternoon, she worked beside Evelyn Sterling, the founder's wife, inside a small child development lab hidden deep in the company's innovation division. Evelyn believed patterns and color therapy could calm children experiencing severe sensory overload. Most executives dismissed the project as expensive charity work. Richard Sterling tolerated it only because he loved his wife enough to fund anything that made her smile. Naomi remembered the blue shapes clearly. Spiral patterns, geometric sequencing cards, visual grounding exercises designed specifically for one child. Eli. Her chest tightened painfully. The last time she saw those therapy files, Eli had still been small enough to fit in Evelyn's lap. Then came the accident. Evelyn Sterling died suddenly during a winter charity flight to Chicago 3 years earlier, and within months the entire therapy division disappeared. Funding gone. Offices emptied. Staff reassigned or terminated. Naomi had lasted 6 more weeks before corporate restructuring pushed her downstairs into maintenance support. Temporary adjustment, human resources called it. Temporary turned permanent fast. Now she cleaned offices she once attended meetings inside. Through the boardroom glass, Richard Sterling slowly stepped away from his son again, helpless frustration pulling his shoulders downward. Eli's cries had weakened into broken whimpers, but his body still trembled violently beneath the table. One executive rubbed his forehead and muttered, "This cannot happen in front of the investors tomorrow." Naomi's eyes hardened slightly. Not one person in that room was looking at Eli anymore. They were looking at inconvenience, liability, optics. Another security guard approached Naomi from behind. "Ma'am, you need to clear the corridor." His tone softened slightly when he noticed her expression. "They are handling it." Naomi looked at him quietly. "No," she said under her breath. "They are not." Before the guard could respond, Naomi turned and walked quickly toward the service elevators. Her worn sneakers squeaked softly against polished marble as she pressed the basement archive button. The elevator doors slid shut around her with a metallic hum. For the first time in years, her heartbeat felt loud enough to hear. Downstairs, the archive level smelled like dust, cardboard, and old paper. Rows of metal shelves stretched beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Most employees never came down here anymore. Sterling Dynamics stored forgotten projects underground the same way wealthy people stored uncomfortable memories. Naomi moved quickly through the aisles, her breathing uneven now. Section C, Behavioral Research. Developmental Systems. She passed faded labels covered in dust until finally she stopped in front of a gray filing cabinet pushed half behind a storage rack. Her hands trembled as she yanked open the bottom drawer. Inside sat a single blue file folder marked in black ink. Project Orbit. Naomi stared at it silently. Even after all these years, she still recognized Evelyn Sterling's handwriting instantly. The blue folder felt heavier than paper should have felt. Naomi held it tightly against her chest as the service elevator climbed back toward the executive floor. Each passing number reflected faintly in the brushed steel doors. Basement. 10. 23. 31. Her pulse would not slow down. She had not touched Project Orbit in nearly 4 years. Not since the day 2 corporate attorneys walked into Evelyn Sterling's lab carrying termination packets and polite smiles that never reached their eyes. "The company is restructuring priorities," they had said while unplugging sensory displays from the walls. Naomi still remembered Eli crying that afternoon because strangers kept removing the blue cards from his therapy table. Evelyn had stood in the center of the room wearing a cream-colored sweater and looking more exhausted than angry. "Some people only understand profit," she whispered quietly after the executives left. "But one day Richard is going to realize his son cannot be managed like a business problem." The elevator doors slid open onto the 42nd floor. The noise hit Naomi instantly. Raised voices. Fast footsteps. The sharp electronic ringing of unanswered phones. Through the glass walls of the boardroom, she could still see executives clustered nervously around the long conference table while Eli remained hidden underneath it. Richard Sterling stood near the windows now, one hand braced against the glass as he stared down at Manhattan glowing beneath the late afternoon sun. He looked trapped between fury and exhaustion. Naomi stepped forward quickly. A young assistant nearly collided with her and stopped short after noticing the maintenance uniform. "You cannot be here right now," he snapped automatically. Naomi kept walking. "Ma'am, I am serious." She ignored him. The folder pressed tighter beneath her arm as she crossed the hallway toward the boardroom doors. Inside, Eli suddenly let out another strained cry that cut through the room like a siren. Every conversation stopped again. Richard turned sharply toward his son. Eli. The boy did not answer. His small body trembled harder beneath the table now. One executive whispered something about calling a hospital. Another quietly suggested sedatives. Naomi reached the boardroom entrance just as security stepped in front of her. Employees are restricted from entering executive meetings, the guard said firmly. Naomi looked past him at the terrified little boy under the table. Then she spoke softly. His mother built this program. The guard frowned. What? Naomi lifted the blue file slightly. I know what he is asking for. Before the guard could stop her, Richard Sterling noticed the movement near the door. His tired eyes narrowed immediately at the sight of a cleaner standing outside the boardroom, carrying company files. What is going on? He demanded. The room shifted toward her all at once. Naomi suddenly felt every expensive watch, every polished shoe, every impatient stare turning in her direction. One executive scoffed quietly. Security needs to remove her. But Naomi did not look at them. She only looked at Richard. Your son keeps asking for blue shapes, she said carefully. I think I know why. Silence spread slowly across the room. Richard stared at her for a long moment, trying to place her face somewhere deep inside old memories that no longer surfaced easily. Naomi stepped forward one pace and held up the file. Project Orbit, she said. The color drained slightly from Richard's expression. For the first time since the panic attack began, his posture changed completely. Not executive. Not billionaire. Just a man suddenly hearing his late wife's name inside a room that had tried very hard to erase her. The room stayed silent long enough for the city noise outside the glass windows to become noticeable again. Car horns drifted faintly upward from 42 floors below. Somewhere in the hallway, an elevator bell chimed softly. But inside the boardroom, nobody moved. Richard Sterling stared at the blue folder in Naomi's hands as though it had risen from the dead. His face tightened slowly, not with anger this time, but recognition. That project was shut down years ago, one executive said carefully, breaking the silence first. Naomi did not look at him. The project was never finished, she replied quietly. Beneath the conference table, Eli whimpered again. His fingers scraped nervously against the carpet while his breathing came in uneven bursts. Blue shapes, he whispered once more. Naomi's throat tightened. Richard finally stepped away from the windows. How do you know about that file? He asked. His voice had changed completely now. Lower. Slower. Naomi met his eyes for the first time since entering the room. Because I helped build the exercises inside it. Confusion spread instantly across several faces around the table. One woman frowned at Naomi's cleaning uniform as if reality itself had stopped making sense. Another executive leaned toward Richard and whispered, Sir, this is inappropriate. Richard ignored him completely. Naomi slowly lowered herself to one knee near the conference table, careful not to move too close to Eli. She remembered Evelyn teaching that exact rule years ago. Never rush toward panic. Let the child decide the distance. The blue folder rested gently in Naomi's hands now. Worn edges. Dust near. The corners. The Sterling Dynamics logo nearly faded away with time. Eli's crying softened slightly the moment he saw it. Naomi noticed immediately. So did Richard. The billionaire's jaw tightened hard enough to flex beneath the light. Open it, he said quietly. Naomi hesitated for half a second. Across the room, several executives exchanged alarmed looks. Sir, that file contains confidential developmental research, one protested. Another added quickly. Legal already archived everything connected to that division after Mrs. Sterling passed away. Naomi almost laughed at the word archived. Such a clean corporate word for forgetting someone existed. Richard never took his eyes off the folder. Open it. Naomi carefully untied the worn cloth string around the file. The sound alone seemed louder than it should have inside the silent room. Slowly, she spread several laminated cards across the polished marble floor beside the table. Blue spirals. Soft geometric patterns. Circular sequences designed to guide visual focus away from sensory overload. Eli stopped rocking instantly. The shift was so sudden that multiple people in the room visibly froze. Naomi remained perfectly still. Do not talk, she whispered softly without looking up. Please. Nobody argued. Eli's wide, frightened eyes slowly lifted toward the blue cards on the floor. His breathing still trembled, but less violently now. Naomi slid one pattern forward only a few inches. A simple blue spiral surrounded by tiny silver stars. Your mom called this the orbit card, Naomi said gently. Richard inhaled sharply beside the windows. It helped when sounds felt too big. Eli stared at the spiral without blinking. Tears clung to his eyelashes. His fingers slowly loosened from his sleeves. One executive shifted nervously. Another quietly lowered his phone. The entire boardroom seemed suspended in place now, trapped between disbelief and hope. Naomi kept her voice low and steady. You are safe, Eli. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then slowly, carefully, the little boy crawled out from beneath the conference table for the first time since the panic attack began. No one in the boardroom dared to breathe too loudly. Eli moved slowly across the marble floor on trembling hands and knees, his oversized blue hoodie dragging softly behind him while the skyline of Manhattan glowed gold through the glass walls around him. Naomi stayed exactly where she was, kneeling beside the scattered therapy cards without reaching toward him. Her posture remained calm, grounded, patient. The same patience Evelyn Sterling used to describe as emotional oxygen for overwhelmed children. Eli's eyes locked onto the blue spiral card in front of him. His breathing still shook unevenly, but the panic inside it was changing now. Less sharp, less trapped. Naomi gently slid another card across the floor. This one carried a sequence of overlapping blue circles fading softly into silver. Orbit path number 3, she whispered. Your mom said this one helped when elevators and loud rooms felt too crowded. Richard Sterling's face shifted visibly at the mention of his wife again. Across the room, several executives stood frozen beside the conference table like strangers who had accidentally wandered into someone else's memory. A woman from legal quietly lowered the tablet she had been clutching against her chest for nearly an hour. Even the security guards near the door seemed unsure whether they were witnessing a crisis or a miracle. Eli stopped moving beside the cards. His small fingers hovered above the spiral pattern without touching it at first. Naomi watched carefully. You do not have to hurry, she said softly. Nothing bad is happening now. The little boy swallowed hard. Then finally, slowly, he placed his hand over the blue spiral. The reaction was immediate. His shoulders loosened. Not fully, just enough for the entire room to notice. Richard took one unconscious step forward before stopping himself again. Naomi recognized the look on his face instantly. Hope frightened people more than failure sometimes, especially after years of disappointment. Eli stared at the card for several long seconds. Then his lips moved slightly, so quietly that at first Naomi thought she imagined it. Mom. The word barely rose above a whisper. Richard inhaled sharply like the air had been knocked out of his chest. Across the boardroom, one executive covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Another man slowly removed his glasses, staring openly now. Eli had not spoken in almost 2 years. Not since Evelyn died. Naomi felt tears sting behind her eyes, but she forced herself to stay steady for the boy. That is right, she whispered gently. Your mom made these for you. Eli looked up at Naomi then, really looked at her for the first time. His frightened eyes searched her face carefully, almost trying to place her somewhere inside old memories that still survived beneath the silence. Naomi smiled softly. You used to call the blue one the galaxy card, she said. You carried it everywhere. Eli blinked once, then twice. His breathing steadied another little bit. Richard suddenly turned away from the room entirely, one hand covering his mouth while he stared out at the city lights beginning to flicker alive below. The billionaire looked smaller somehow standing there beside the windows. Older. The silence inside the boardroom no longer felt tense now. It felt fragile. Sacred almost. Naomi carefully gathered one more card from the folder and placed it beside Eli. Unlike the others, this one showed a hand-drawn constellation pattern with tiny silver stars circling a bright blue center. Eli's eyes widened instantly. Naomi's chest tightened. She had forgotten this card existed. Written in small cursive letters across the bottom corner were words in Evelyn Sterling's handwriting. For Eli. So you always remember your way back home. The handwritten note at the bottom of the card seemed to pull all the air out of the room. Eli stared at the tiny silver stars circling the blue center while his fingertips traced the edges carefully, almost reverently, as if touching something fragile enough to disappear. Naomi watched the tension slowly leave his shoulders inch by inch. Not completely, just enough to let silence finally settle over the boardroom for the first time in nearly an hour. Outside the towering glass windows, the last light of evening stretched across Manhattan in soft orange reflections. Office buildings glowed alive one floor at a time while traffic moved, like ribbons of red beneath the city skyline. Inside Sterling Dynamics, nobody spoke. Nobody checked their phones anymore. The quarterly merger meeting had ceased to exist. All that remained was a little boy sitting on the marble floor beside a woman the company barely noticed yesterday. Eli's breathing softened further as he held the constellation card against his chest. "Mom made this," he whispered quietly. Richard turned sharply toward him. Tears stood openly in the billionaire's eyes now, though he looked almost embarrassed by them. "Yes," Naomi answered gently before Richard could speak. She stayed late 3 nights drawing that one because the printed versions did not feel personal enough. A faint sound escaped Richard's throat, something between a laugh and heartbreak. He lowered himself slowly into one of the leather conference chairs nearby, elbows resting against his knees while he stared at the floor. Naomi had seen powerful men collapse before. Not financially, emotionally. It always happened quietly. "I thought all of this was destroyed," Richard said after a long silence. Naomi glanced down at the folder resting beside her. Most of it was. Her voice remained calm, but memories pressed heavily behind every word now. After Mrs. Sterling passed away, the company closed the therapy division within 6 weeks. The research rooms were emptied. The staff was reassigned. She hesitated briefly. Some of us were easier to move than others. Several executives shifted uncomfortably at that sentence. Nobody looked directly at Naomi anymore. Not because they dismissed her now, but because suddenly they remembered how invisible they had allowed her to become. Eli slowly leaned closer to the folder, studying another card partially hidden beneath the others. Naomi carefully pulled it free. This one showed overlapping blue pathways designed like a maze. "This was your favorite when the thunderstorms came," she told him softly. "You used to call it the safe road." Eli looked at her with quiet concentration. "You remember," he whispered. Naomi smiled sadly. "Some things are too important to forget." Richard closed his eyes briefly at those words. The city. Lights flickered across his face through the windows, softening the hard edges that usually made him look untouchable in magazines and shareholder meetings. For years, people described Richard Sterling as a man who controlled everything. Markets, competitors, entire industries. But grief had clearly defeated him in ways business never could. "I did not know they reassigned you downstairs," he admitted quietly. Naomi looked at her rubber gloves for a moment before answering. Most executives did not notice. The honesty in her voice carried no bitterness. Somehow that made it hurt more. Eli suddenly shifted closer until his shoulder lightly touched Naomi's arm. It was such a small movement that half the room nearly missed it. But Richard saw. Naomi felt him see it too. The billionaire's expression broke completely then, not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly enough to reveal how long he had been carrying guilt without knowing where to place it. Eli looked down at the constellation card once more before speaking again, his voice soft and uncertain. "Can we take the stars home?" Richard Sterling stared at his son for several long seconds before answering. The question had been so small, so simple, yet somehow it shattered something inside the room that billion-dollar negotiations never could. "Yes," Richard said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "You can take the stars home." Eli tightened his fingers around the constellation card immediately, pressing it carefully against his chest like something alive. Naomi watched him quietly while the boardroom lights reflected softly across the polished marble floor around them. The panic attack was gone now. Not hidden. Gone. In its place sat a tired little boy surrounded by pieces of a memory everyone else had buried years ago. Near the windows, several executives slowly began gathering their papers in awkward silence, but none of them actually left. Nobody wanted to be the first person to walk away from what they had just witnessed. One older board member finally cleared his throat carefully. "Richard," he said, still visibly shaken. "We had specialists working with Eli for almost 2 years." Richard did not answer. Right away, his eyes remained fixed on Naomi. "I know," he said quietly. "I paid them millions." The honesty in his voice landed heavily across the room. Naomi lowered her gaze slightly. uncomfortable with so much attention suddenly pointed at her. For years, she had mastered invisibility inside this building. Quiet shoes, lowered eyes, small nods in elevators. She cleaned offices after midnight precisely because powerful people preferred not to see the people who maintained their world. But now every executive in the room stared at her differently, not as maintenance staff, as someone holding a truth they somehow missed. Richard slowly stood from the conference chair and walked toward the therapy cards scattered across the floor. His expensive dress shoes stopped inches from the blue spiral Eli still held in his hand. "You said you helped build these exercises," he said softly. Naomi nodded once. Mrs. Sterling believed sensory memory worked better when emotions were attached to visuals. She wanted Eli to associate patterns with safety instead of fear. Richard closed his eyes briefly at the mention of his wife again. "She never told me how much work went into this." Naomi hesitated before answering. "I do not think she believed you were ready to listen back then." Several executives exchanged uneasy looks at that statement, but Richard surprised everyone by nodding slowly instead of becoming defensive. "She used to tell me that," he admitted quietly. "Said I tried to solve emotions like business problems." A faint smile touched Naomi's face for the first time all evening. She was usually right. To everyone's surprise, Richard actually laughed softly under his breath. The sound felt unfamiliar inside the cold executive boardroom. "Human." Eli looked between them carefully, still clutching the constellation card against his hoodie. "Miss Naomi?" he asked suddenly. Naomi turned toward him instantly. "Yes, sweetheart." Eli pointed toward the open blue folder beside her. "Are there more?" Naomi's chest tightened painfully. There were hundreds more. Years of handwritten therapy notes, emotional mapping exercises, sensory grounding systems Evelyn Sterling designed, specifically for her son before the company erased the entire division after her death. Naomi slowly opened another section of the folder. Inside rested dozens of untouched therapy cards stacked neatly beneath old research notes. Eli's eyes widened with quiet wonder. Richard stared down at the folder as realization slowly spread across his face. Not just grief this time. Guilt. Deep and unmistakable. Because while he spent years searching for expensive solutions across the country, the thing his son needed most had been sitting forgotten beneath his own building the entire time. The boardroom looked completely different now. An hour earlier it had been filled with tension, sharp voices, and executives obsessed with schedules and contracts. Now the only sound came from Eli quietly flipping through therapy cards beside Naomi on the marble floor. The little boy sat cross-legged near the conference table, carefully arranging blue patterns into small rows while the skyline outside faded into deep evening blue. Richard Sterling stood nearby watching his son with the stunned expression of someone seeing sunlight after years underground. Every few seconds, Eli glanced toward Naomi as if making sure she was still there. And every single time, she gave him the same calm, reassuring smile. One by one, the executives slowly left the boardroom without speaking. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others glanced awkwardly toward Naomi before disappearing into the hallway. The expensive room that once felt cold and untouchable now carried something softer inside it. Something human. Richard waited until the final board member exited before finally speaking again. "How long?" he asked quietly. Naomi looked up from the therapy cards. "How long what?" Richard swallowed once before answering. "How long were you downstairs cleaning floors while all of this sat forgotten in storage?" Naomi hesitated. 3 years. The answer landed heavily between them. Richard slowly looked around the massive boardroom as if seeing the building differently for the first time. Every polished wall, every piece of glass, every silent hallway Naomi cleaned overnight while carrying memories his own. Company erased. "Why did you stay?" he asked finally. Naomi glanced toward Eli before speaking. "Because your wife believed what she built here mattered." Her voice stayed gentle, but steady. "And because I could not walk away knowing Eli might still need it someday." Richard lowered his head briefly. The billionaire looked exhausted now in a way no business magazine would ever photograph. "I failed him," he admitted softly. Naomi shook her head immediately. "No." Richard looked surprised by the answer. Naomi carefully gathered several therapy cards into a neat stack before continuing. "You loved him. That part was never the problem." She looked toward the skyline glowing outside the windows. But grief made everybody start reacting instead of listening. Silence settled again. Eli quietly picked up the constellation card and walked toward his father. The little boy held the card up with both hands. "Mom made this for me," he whispered. Richard took the card carefully, his fingers trembling slightly around the edges. For several seconds, he simply stared at Evelyn's handwriting beneath the silver stars. Then something inside him finally gave way. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet release of pain carried far too long. "I should have protected this," he said under his breath. Naomi looked at him kindly. "Then protect it now." Richard slowly raised his eyes toward her. "Come upstairs tomorrow morning," he said. "Not as maintenance staff." Naomi immediately shook her head. "Mr. Sterling, I do not need charity." "This is not charity," Richard interrupted gently. "You walked into a room full of executives tonight and saw my son more clearly than all of us combined." His voice tightened slightly. "Including me." Naomi said nothing. Eli quietly moved closer beside her again, still holding the edge of her sleeve lightly between his fingers. Richard noticed immediately. "He trusts you," he whispered. Naomi looked down at the child beside her. "He trusts what reminds him of his mother." Richard stared at them both for a long moment before speaking again. "Then maybe this company forgot the wrong person." By the time the clock on the executive wall reached 9:40 p.m., Sterling Dynamics had gone almost completely quiet. The endless stream of assistants, attorneys, and executives that normally filled the upper floors had disappeared hours ago, leaving only the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of elevators moving through the skyscraper. Inside the boardroom, the therapy cards still rested across the marble floor like scattered pieces of memory finally brought back into the light. Eli sat near the windows now, knees tucked against his chest while the constellation card remained safely in his hands. Every few moments he looked up at Naomi just to make sure she had not left. And every time, she was still there. Calm, present, real. Richard Sterling stood near the conference table with his suit jacket folded over one arm, looking less like one of the most powerful men in Manhattan and more like a father trying to remember how to breathe again. The city lights reflected softly across the glass behind him, stretching silver and gold across the room. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Eli slowly stood from the floor and walked toward the windows overlooking the river below. Naomi watched carefully as he pressed one small hand against the cool glass. "The cars look like stars," he whispered softly. Richard closed his eyes briefly at the sound of his son speaking again. Naomi felt her own chest tighten. Some moments were too delicate for celebration. They only asked for silence. Eli turned back toward Naomi after a few seconds. "Will you come tomorrow?" he asked quietly. The question hung in the room with surprising weight. Naomi hesitated. Years of disappointment had taught her not to trust sudden kindness from powerful people. She had seen corporations praise empathy in speeches while quietly burying the humans who carried it. But Eli's eyes were not corporate. They were hopeful, and hope was harder to walk away from. "If your father wants me here," she answered gently, "then yes." Richard immediately looked up. "I do." His voice carried no hesitation now, only certainty. Naomi nodded slowly. Nothing dramatic. No speeches. No tears. Just acceptance. The kind built from exhaustion, memory, and quiet understanding. Richard walked toward the therapy cards scattered across the floor and carefully knelt beside them. Billionaire founders did not kneel often, but tonight he gathered every single blue card with careful hands, stacking them one by one like objects too valuable to lose again. Eli watched him silently before walking back toward Naomi. Without saying a word, the little boy slipped his hand into hers. Naomi looked down in surprise. His grip was small, warm, trusting. Richard saw it and stopped moving entirely. For years he had searched for doctors, specialists, medications, and programs powerful enough to reach his son. In the end, the breakthrough came from the one person his company had taught itself not to see. Outside the skyscraper windows, light rain finally began falling across Manhattan, soft droplets streaking gently against the glass while traffic shimmered below like rivers of color. Naomi stood quietly beside Eli near the windows as the city moved around them. Behind them, Richard carefully placed the restored Project Orbit folder back onto the conference table where it belonged. Not hidden underground. Not forgotten. Seen. The boardroom lights reflected softly across the blue constellation